Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and this evening I'm joined by Kieran and Andrieu. Welcome to the show, Kieran.
Thanks for having me back, Michael. Like all of us, I'm sure, trying to enjoy my summer despite the procession of bad news.
And we do have some really bad news. Tonight, mass starvation is spreading rapidly in Gaza. Over 100 humanitarian organizations have put out a call for action. We also have a very damning report from Unite's current leadership about the previous leadership. That's Len McCluskey, of course, over the issue of a very, very expensive hotel. We also will end the show discussing protests in Epping, or how they have spilled into Canary Wharf, and whether we're going to be looking at another summer of far-right protests. Stay tuned for all of that. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support, and make sure to let us know your comments in the YouTube chat, or you can tweet us on the hashtag NovaraLive. As Israel-enforced hunger spreads across the Gaza Strip, the world's alarm bells are ringing ever louder. Today, more than 100 humanitarian groups have warned of imminent starvation in Gaza. In a joint letter signed by 111 international aid organizations, the agencies say this: as mass starvation spreads across Gaza, our colleagues and those we serve are wasting away. As the Israeli government siege starves the people of Gaza, aid workers are now joining the same food lines, risking being shot just to feed their families. With supplies now totally depleted, humanitarian organizations are witnessing their own colleagues and partners waste away before their eyes. So really, really sort of striking framing there. It's not just that this is sort of hitting the civilians of Gaza, but their very own workforce. So people who are working for the aid agencies themselves are starving, which just shows that there's just no food, right? It's not that the agencies are struggling to distribute it, it's that they don't have enough even for their own staff. The agencies, which include Médecins Sans Frontières, Save the Children, and Oxfam, say relying on the Israel-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to distribute food is untenable. It's always been untenable, and with hundreds of Palestinians killed while seeking food. And they say the starvation of civilians is a war crime. The agencies say they are all ready and waiting to step in if only they're allowed to. So they say the UN-led humanitarian system has not failed. It has been prevented from functioning. Humanitarian agencies have the capacity and supplies to respond at scale, but with access denied, we are blocked from reaching those in need, including our own exhausted and starved teams. On July the 10th, the EU and Israel announced steps to scale up aid, but these promises of progress ring hollow when there is no real change on the ground. Every day without a sustained flow means more people dying of preventable illnesses. Children starve while waiting for promises that never arrive. They add this: Palestinians are trapped in a cycle of hope and heartbreak, waiting for assistance and ceasefires, only to wake up to worsening conditions. It is not just physical torment, but psychological. Survival is dangled like a mirage. The humanitarian system cannot run on false promises. Humanitarians cannot operate on shifting timelines or wait for political commitments that fail to deliver access. I mean, that statement, the agencies also correctly point out the country behind the suffering, condemning the Israeli government's siege for creating conditions of chaos, starvation, and death. And death by starvation has already arrived in Gaza. At least 80 children have already died of acute hunger in the enclave, including 4 who died yesterday. Reuters has produced this short report on them. Some of this you may find distressing.
A 6-week-old infant and 3 other children have died of starvation in Gaza in the past 24 hours. That's according to local health officials on Tuesday, who said malnutrition and starvation are now killing Palestinians faster than at any point in the 21-month war. The infant died at a hospital ward in northern Gaza, the health officials said, naming him as Yusuf al-Safadi. His uncle told Reuters a box of formula costs $100. The family could not afford it.
The mother can't breastfeed. There's no food or drinks, so there's no breast milk. The baby died of malnutrition. The child had malnutrition and the mother had malnutrition. This is the case for all of Gaza Strip's children.
Palestinian health officials say at least 101 people have died of starvation during the conflict, including 80 children, with most of them in recent weeks. Ghada al-Fayoumi is a mother of 7 in Gaza City.
My children wake up sick every day. One of them is sick every other day. What do? I go get a saline solution for them. What can I do? There's no food, no bread, no food, no drinks, no rice, no sugar, no cooking oil, no bulgur, nothing. There is no kind of any food available to us at all.
Israel controls all aid supplies into the war-ravaged enclave, where most of the population has been displaced multiple times and faces acute shortages of basic necessities.
We need look no further than the horror show in Gaza. Malnourishment is soaring. Starvation is knocking on every door.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the world was witnessing, quote, the last gasp of a humanitarian system.
I mean, sort of social media, rightly has just been full of people sharing those pictures of just completely emaciated Palestinians, many of them children. And, this is one of those examples where you see people sort of comparing it to what happened in the Second World War, and you've got pictures from the Holocaust of people who are being intentionally starved, and these are people being intentionally starved. There's no other way of putting it. And 43 Palestinians have died of starvation across Gaza since Sunday, but starvation isn't only about death, it's about prolonged suffering of the most acute kind. According to the World Food Programme, more than a third of Palestinians in Gaza are going for extended periods of time without any food at all. Around 100,000 women and children are suffering from severe and acute malnutrition, leading to rapid weight loss, fatigue, and loss of cognitive function. And 500,000 people, that's at least a quarter of Gaza's surviving population, are living in famine-like conditions. Of course, Israel continues to claim that none of this inhuman treatment has anything to do with it. This was Israeli spokesperson David Menzer speaking to reporters today.
This idea of famine and starvation has been thrown at us consistently on a weekly basis for the last 2 years now. It has never come to pass. So these are false warnings which come from these aid organizations. And I also would say that where there is hunger in Gaza, it is hunger orchestrated by Hamas. This is very clearly their tactic, and it is working.
And it is just, it's pure evil, isn't it? To sort of go out on the television and say this famine is fake. It's not real. It's made up by all the most respected, prestigious, experienced aid organizations in the world. And we can see the pictures of emaciated children and babies ourselves. And he says, no, it's not coming to pass. It's fake. It's a lie. Right, and he's standing up there and saying it. Maybe some people in Israel believe it. I don't think really anyone believes it anywhere else. Earlier today, I was joined by Omar Shakir. He's Palestine lead at Human Rights Watch. Shakir today published a report from Human Rights Watch calling for an end to Israeli-engineered mass starvation. I began by asking him how he understands the reality on the ground in Gaza right now when it comes to mass starvation.
The humanitarian situation in Gaza is at its lowest point in Gaza's modern history. The world's foremost experts on famine back in May warned that famine was imminent, that the entire population faced a high degree of food insecurity, and the situation has only gotten worse. Only a small number of trucks are being allowed in to serve more than 2 million people. This is a population that even before October 2023, 80% relied on humanitarian aid. The Israeli government has been methodically and systematically blocking the entry of aid. They have been destroying the agriculture and kind of food sources within Gaza. So there's almost nothing available on the local market. Not enough trucks are reaching people in Gaza where they live. The new Gaza Humanitarian Foundation distribution points have become death traps, where over 750 Palestinians have been killed, according to the UN, seeking food from those sites in recent weeks. So people are starving. Humanitarian organizations report that people skip meals. Some go days at a time without eating. It is very difficult for people to find lentils and pasta and kind of the most basic ingredients to feed themselves. And this is a human-made catastrophe. It is the result of a deliberate Israeli government policy to block the entry of food and aid as a tool to pressure Hamas. It is not only collective punishment, but it's the use of starvation of civilians as a weapon of war, which are war crimes. But it's also part of a strategy that, when we looked at the facts, became inescapable. It was part of a strategy to inflict conditions of life designed to destroy the Palestinian people, making it an act of genocide and a crime against humanity of extermination.
And in your post today for Human Rights Watch, you said Palestinian starvation has likely resulted in thousands of deaths. I know, sort of reading the papers today, it's sort of been suggesting that over 100 people have died directly from starvation. I wondered, could you just sort of explain these numbers and sort of how you come to them? Because it can be quite confusing, sort of hearing all these different numbers about how many people have died from what cause.
Absolutely. So look, when we're talking specifically about dehydration, malnutrition, and deaths as a result of the breakdown in the healthcare system, we're talking about hidden deaths. The formal death count from the Gaza Ministry of Health is approaching 60,000. Those are people that are directly killed as a result of the hostilities. The Gaza Ministry of Health has also published a figure of 43 people in the last week and over 100 most in recent weeks over the course of the hostilities that have died as a result directly of malnutrition. That's sort of their direct cause of death. But what doctors, nurses, epistemologists, others that we have spoken to have talked to us about is the other indirect deaths, right? So when people are starving, they are, according to one doctor's testimony, 10 times more likely to die for treatment for other conditions, that people that are going into the hospital with otherwise preventable disease or injuries aren't able because their body is weaker, because they lack the nutrients to survive. So those deaths won't be directly as a result of the dehydration, malnutrition, but as an indirect result. We're also here talking about disease, right? Because the lack of access to clean water, which again, Human Rights Watch has documented as deliberate policy, means that, sanitation, that means that having water available for medical procedures, for drinking, for showering, for bathing isn't available. That can create disease that also leads, to death. In addition to all of that, there's of course the systematic destruction of healthcare facilities, right? Which means that people who might be going into, for example, that might have cancer, or maybe less seriously, that are going in for, dialysis, or even more serious, that are going in because they have a high fever, or they're a child that that needs vaccines taken, isn't able to take their vaccines. If you think about just having a healthcare system that has been systematically targeted by the Israeli government, where hundreds of attacks on hospitals, much of the hospital infrastructure, operating at not operating or operating in partial capacity, that creates all these second order effects that likely means that thousands have died beyond the tens of thousands directly killed over the 21 months of hostilities.
And so today we've had this letter from over 100 aid organisations, some of the sort of biggest, most prestigious, most sort of trusted, really, aid organisations in the world, Oxfam, Save the Children, Médecins Sans Frontières, saying that not only is mass starvation taking place among Gaza's citizens and civilians, but also among their own aid workers. So their own aid workers can't access food. I suppose the question from my audience might be, what will it take? If you've already got all of the most renowned, prestigious aid organizations in the world saying mass starvation is happening now, where does one go from here, I suppose, is the question I want to put to you.
I think you hit the nail on the head. Let's be clear. This is a man-made, human-made catastrophe. The Israeli government could tomorrow flip the switch, allow aid in at scale. We saw that happen during the ceasefire, right? And earlier this year, where 600 trucks a day were entering, where the humanitarian situation improved. Again, it can only improve to a certain degree when you have much of Gaza that's now been reduced to rubble and, all the underlying conditions, but at least address the kinds of alarming reports you hear now. And I think this statement that came out today, and there have been others, all really highlight that the desperation in Gaza is reaching a different level. The good news is we know what it takes. It takes the Israeli government changing their policy. And the international community is not powerless to stop them. Earlier this week, we saw, the UK and more than 24 other governments issue a strong statement calling on Israel to lift their restrictions on aid. But words are not enough. What's needed now is action. So what are we talking about when we talk about action? Under the Genocide Convention, I should note, states have a duty to use all forms of leverage in order to address a risk of genocide. And you don't need an authoritative determination. Even the risk, which the International Court of Justice warned about a year and a half ago, is there. So, states need to use all their leverage. They need to suspend preferential trade agreements. They should sanction Israeli officials that are carrying out the starvation policy. They should impose a full arms embargo on the Israeli government, not just stopping some weapons, but all weapons. They should make clear that they will execute the International Criminal Court's arrest warrants against the Prime Minister Netanyahu and all the other warrants. So there is a set, and the other good news is we've seen that when there is political will among states with leverage, powerful states to act, the Israeli government will change its policy, right? It's because of the Trump administration coming into power that Israel agreed to the first ceasefire. It's in large part, because European states were going to review the association agreement that Israel lifted its total blockade and began letting some, obviously not nowhere near enough aid in back in May. So leverage works if it's used, but what's needed is concrete, measurable action and not just words.
And I suppose when it comes to leverage, there's also the question of at what point do these Western governments say, okay, fine, you've satisfied us now? Because I remember, a couple of months ago, the siege you've just sort of referenced there, when there was a sort of total blockade of anything going into Gaza whatsoever for 2 months. There was this building of international pressure on Netanyahu and on Israel. And that was the point at which they said, okay, we're going to roll out this sort of Potemkin aid organization called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which ended up being, this organization that made Gazans queue for food and then before it killed them. So this sort of macabre fake aid organization, which Netanyahu, I think, was explicitly saying, or at least according to reporting, that this was purely as a sop to the West. They needed to reduce some of the pressure from the West, so they'll start this organization and end the siege. Do you see us sort of entering a cycle like that again? Is there something that Netanyahu and the Israelis can say over the next, 7 days that gives, I suppose, the Western governments an excuse to say, oh, we got a win here, so we're going to back off?
No, it's a great question, because the Israeli government has years and decades of experience doing just enough to avoid serious international censure. I mean, the European Union, I think shamefully, they had opened a review of the association agreement, and they literally got a set of oral commitments from the Israeli government to improve the aid situation. And they said, okay, you know what? We're not going to take any further action on it. Even if all of those measures were implemented, which they haven't been implemented, they would not go far enough just to deal with the aid crisis. The Israeli government has mastered the art of changing the goalpost. The situation gets so bad that, the ceiling for demands gets so far lowered. And that's a real risk. And I think that's a question for every government. Are you going to let the Israeli government, pull a fast one on you? And I think it's incumbent on states to understand here what needs to happen. A ceasefire in and of itself is not enough. And that's maybe the most imminent thing that could be coming. And we don't know, but many states seem to have deluded themselves into thinking that's the solution to the problem. But ceasefire or not, unlawful attacks can take place. Aid needs to come in at scale. Rebuilding must be allowed to proceed. The unlawful movement restrictions need to be lifted. All the abuse of occupation, needs to end. So there's so many different things that need to happen. And I think there's a risk of what you said, that, the Israeli government will take a half measure or less, and states will back off on pressure. And that's the calculation the Israeli government continues to make, and states continue to fall for it. So I think it's really a challenge. And it's not just a challenge that has implications for Palestinian civilians. It's one that has challenge for the entire rules-based international order, because when states fail to respect the law, when they fail to act pursuant to their duties under the Genocide Convention, the Geneva Convention, the Rome Statute, these are really major parts of the international rules-based order. And when they're ignored, it undermines protections for civilians everywhere.
As to what the government has done, yesterday the UK government, along with 26 other nations, managed to muster up the courage to issue a statement, once again politely asking Israel to comply with international law. The situation is now so desperate, though, that even Britain's right-wing press are taking a stronger stance. Today's cover of the Daily Express, of all newspapers, carries a photo of a starving 1-year-old, Mohammed Al-Matouk, and it says, "For pity's sake, stop this now." Kieran, I mean, is there any sense in which you think that Daily Express front page represents somewhat of a watershed when it comes to discourse about this in the UK?
Well, I hope so. And I think I hate to say this, but we are desperate. We're all of us utterly desperate now. So I think there's a strategic approach to encouraging the Daily Express and other media quarters like that to continue to do things like this, while at the same time holding space, hopefully, once justice is done, for the Gazans that are still left, insofar as holding the British media to account for failing to spot that all of their cheerleading of Israel was going to result in this. So I suppose that's my general position on the Daily Express, and Piers Morgan and characters like that arriving late to all of this. More generally, Michael, I grew up, a British kid with Palestinian family. That's how I saw it. And always trying to alert my little school friends or teachers or whatever, 20, 25 years ago, when less was known about Palestine, to the nature of Israel vis-a-vis Palestinians, how it treated Palestinians. And I always thought in that context that it was important to not over-egg things or engage in hyperbole, right? I thought comparisons to Nazis and to Nazi Germany were unhelpful. But it's now blindingly obvious that what Israel has done to Gaza is positively and unmistakably Nazi. The Nazis starved a population as a final solution. And obviously now Israel has done exactly the same in Gaza. And just as the Holocaust was the end product of dehumanization and systematic racism, so is the Holocaust in Gaza. We saw this morning James O'Brien apologize for facilitating a phone-in which a caller said that his wife had experienced a Jewish school growing up in which she was taught that Arabs are cockroaches and that Jewish life is worth 50 times more than any single Arab life. And indeed, our own Rivka Brown quote tweeted James O'Brien to confirm that that had been her experience at Jewish school as well. Now, there are many, many Jewish schools, no doubt, that completely reject that kind of thing. And of course, there are many hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of Jews who despise that tenet of Zionism, as well as many, many others. But that process of systematically equating human beings with cockroaches is absolutely indivisible from the genocide by starvation of babies and people in Gaza. It cannot happen without it. And surely, actually, that's the non or anti-Semitic, the non-racist thing to say. Because either people are willing to support a genocide because they've had it systematically inculcated into them from day dot that the people being exterminated don't count, or they are just cosmically evil. And until my dying day, thank you very much, Israel Lobby, I choose to believe the former.
Former Unite boss Len McCluskey enjoyed private jet flights and football tickets arranged by a firm which won a multi-million-pound contract to build a hotel for the union he ran. And that's according to a new internal report commissioned by Sharon Graham. She's McCluskey's successor as leader of Unite. And the internal report also found that the building company Flanagan Group overcharged Unite £30 million for the building of the hotel. Flanagan Group is run by friends of McCluskey. The Unite Birmingham Hotel has long been a costly embarrassment. Under McCluskey's leadership, the union spent over £110 million on building the hotel and conference centre, but it is now valued at only £38 million, meaning a massive loss for the union, tens of millions of pounds, presumably down the drain. And that is funded by workers' membership fees. It's their money that goes down the drain in a situation such as this. Sharon Graham told the BBC this.
I was astounded. I could feel the pit of my stomach drop. There's no way to gloss this up. There's no way to pretend that actually it was a whoopsie-daisy moment. There's either two things that have gone on here. With £70 million adrift, it's either rank incompetence or it's something else.
How did this happen, though? You were working at the union at the time in a reasonably senior position. How did you not spot anything?
Well, Norm, it's because we weren't sort of in those meetings. That's why we've got to make sure that the governance of the union is strengthened.
And last year, the Serious Fraud Office launched an investigation into the development of the hotel. The issues surrounding it, that investigation remains ongoing. The internal Unite report, though, is absolutely scathing. It says Unite awarded Flanagan Group the contract to build the hotel with, quote, no competitive tendering process. And they say, and despite the firm, quote, having a history of poor performance, delays and cost overruns on previous contracts. It also found that Mr. McCluskey overruled, they say, advice from staff and the union's lawyers in signing the construction contract with Flanagan Group. McCluskey, for his part, denies any wrongdoing. And this is from the BBC write-up. So it says, Mr. McCluskey's lawyers said he was unaware of the concerns of staff or union lawyers at the time the construction contract was signed, does not recall signing the principal contract, and was not involved in the decision to select Flanagan Group. His lawyers have said he categorically rejects any suggestions of improper dealings. The Flanagan Group, for their part, did not respond to repeated requests for comments, but has previously told the BBC it was proud of its work on the scheme and costs had risen due to radical changes to design and working practices. Earlier today, I spoke to Novara Media's Labour Movement correspondent, Polly Smythe, and I asked her how concerned or angry Unite members should be.
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that I've not really seen asked so often in the reporting of this. The framing has been about Corbyn, it's been about the left, and it's not been about members who pay money into Unite in order to have their working lives improved, about what they think. And I think if I was a member and I was paying my union dues to Unite, I would be really angry. You know, you're putting money into a collective organisation to try and improve your working life, and that money has not been spent on that objective. So I think they should be really angry.
I just want to go to a section from the reports. This is from the internal report, which, Len McCluskey in no way sort of accepts. So we should put that out front and centre first. But this is from a section of the report on the plane tickets and football matches. So it says, Len McCluskey regularly attended Liverpool FC matches with the owners of the main contractors. That's the people Unite were paying to build the hotel. McCluskey's tickets were consistently organised and paid for by one of the owners of the main contractor or by the main contractor. They also arranged flights for Len McCluskey, including at least one private jet flight. And they say the evidence for this comes from tickets and flight information sent to Len McCluskey's Unite email. There is no indication that Len McCluskey later reimbursed them. And then you've got a big sort of blocked out, redacted section for whatever reason. But then this is, I suppose, the kicker. Example of tickets from the Unite emails include UEFA Champions League Final 2018, tickets and flight to Kyiv. UEFA Champions League Final 2019, tickets and private jet booking to Madrid for McCluskey and Carrie Murphy. Now, and then you've got some sort of Premier League matches. Now, this is the kind of thing where, if this was Keir Starmer or Boris Johnson, we would be having a field day with this and we would be, we'd be calling this corrupt. Is there any possible defence I think McCluskey said maybe he paid them back. I'm not sure, but it just really doesn't look good on the face of it, does it?
No, I mean, leaving McCluskey's individual defence out of it, as you say rightly, he's via lawyers denied allegations. I do think that trade unions operate very differently to, say, politicians, Johnson or Starmer. Unions are under attack by, all sorts of people, whether that's the right-wing press, whether that is politicians. And as such, there really can be a mentality of, not wanting to air dirty laundry in public. And that can be problematic. When I covered the TSSA, which is a railway and transport union scandal a couple of years ago, where there were allegations of sexual misconduct, part of the reason they took so long to come to light was because, the senior leadership was saying, this is a gift to the Daily Mail. So, clearly there is, a real pressure often to keep a lid on things. And I think that can lead to toxic behavior not coming to light. But, what I would say is, trade unions are right to think that reports like this will be used against them. One person I was speaking to said it's not inconceivable, a few years down the line, if we have a reform Tory government, that they might look at reports like this and use it as the basis to justify, further interference into the rights of trade unions. So whilst that's not a defence, I do think that the way in which we have these conversations about trade unions is very different to politicians.
And this is a report, this isn't a report coming from the right-wing press, this is a report coming from within the union. That doesn't necessarily mean that politics aren't involved. So Sharon Graham, who's the current General Secretary of Unite, is from a different faction of the union to Len McCluskey. The report speaks quite disparagingly of the United Left, which is McCluskey's faction, which Sharon Graham stood against and won. So should we perhaps have a sort of critical eye in the sense that maybe Sharon Graham and her team have a incentive to make her predecessor look as bad as possible? Or, do you think there's anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, so Sharon Graham's been serving as General Secretary since 2021 when she beat Len McCluskey's successor, Steve Turner. And, when she was running, a big part of Sharon's election campaign was essentially to differentiate herself from Len as much as possible. And back then, that was done much more about her industrial stance. And so, she said that engagement with the Labour Party, as Len McCluskey had been very close to Corbyn, had failed, and that she wanted to return to the workplace. And so, I think anything for Sharon that puts clear water between her and Len, whether that's this report or whether that's the different approaches to running the union, will of course, play a part. And I think, with the general election, also with the election for the general secretary role coming up, I think this report is going to clearly, form part of Sharon's basis for her re-election. And you're right to say that, covering unions is difficult because there are factions, and it's quite easy to be accused of factionalism just simply by covering the factions. But yeah, you're completely right that the report obviously does not exist outside of those border politics.
And how embarrassing do you think this is for the left more broadly? Len McCluskey is still really a stalwart of the left, but especially under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, big backer of Corbyn. Many people said that Corbyn would never have won the leadership if it weren't for the backing of Unite and Len McCluskey. I'm sure Carrie Murphy would deny any wrongdoing or anything to do with this, but she was on one of those private jet flights to a Champions League final. She was obviously one of Corbyn's closest advisors. Seems also to be involved in the development of a new left-wing party. Again, you don't want to say just because someone was on this jet that they're necessarily implicated, but it doesn't look good, does it?
No, it certainly doesn't. And I think one of the things in the report that I found most disturbing reading is that there were allegations, that partly the overspend was to do with the fact that the hotel was using unionised labour. And now the report is saying that it's actually not clear that unionised labour was used to construct the hotel. And I think the left is bad about talking about, hypocrisy, and also stories like this, which are such a gift to the right-wing press, and are picked up and led and used often to justify conclusions that the left wouldn't share. I think it's difficult for us to talk about. It's difficult for us to discuss. But yeah, I think, it is embarrassing. And transparency and discussion of it is the right way forward. And it's also important to note that this isn't the only inquiry that Unite has going on at the moment. Unite is got an independent inquiry that is investigating allegations of collusion between Unite trade union officials and the construction industry in the blacklisting inquiry. So this isn't the end of kind of possible embarrassments for Unite. And I think it's important that the left is able to have these discussions without the fear that we're simply playing into a right-wing trap.
And why were Unite building a hotel in the first place? Because, as far as I understand from this report and from the reporting about it, everyone agrees that this hotel has been a financial flop because it cost a lot more to build than it is now valued at. And the disagreement is about whether that was cock-up or conspiracy and who's to blame. But I suppose you could take a step back and say, why were they building a hotel in the first place? Like that, there's clearly a big financial risk there, and a trade union probably isn't, in the business of building hotels. It's difficult to do something you don't normally do, and then to spend tens of millions of pounds on it does seem like a risk. Why? What was the thinking behind the need for a multi-million-pound Unite hotel?
So my understanding is that the reason are twofold. The first was that kind of ironically now, given the financial situation, it would be an investment for the union. And the second was that it would offer a location or, a venue for the union to meet, whether that was for conferences or whether that was for, reps and workers to meet. So that was the justification that the union itself gave.
So I suppose, what do you think are the broader lessons from this? I often do hear on the left sort of people saying unions should do more. They should be sort of building assets in communities and trying to branch out of sort of their traditional role. I suppose one thing you might take from this is maybe they should stick to their traditional role, because when they try and, build assets or sort of step out of their lane, it can go quite wrong. Would that be a reasonable interpretation from what's happened here?
The question of what unions should do is kind of a fascinating one, and there's so many different answers. I think, clearly this has been, an abject disaster kind of on any account. I think to understand fully the hotel, it helps to go a little bit back in time. McCluskey was elected in 2010, and the industrial context back then was really different. You know, it was a real low ebb for strike activity, and you know there were some big industrial disputes, but actually nothing on the scale that we've seen. You know, subsequent to what was generally dubbed hot strike summer. And I think when there is a much more live industrial movement, the questions about where members' money are going and being put is more live, because is that money being put into strike funds per se? And so that kind of context informs whether or not we might get a situation of alleged fraud, which as Christina McInerney, who's the Unison General Secretary, said on Newsnight last night, this is very much the exception and not the norm.
That was my colleague, Polly Smythe. I'm just going to go to a response McCluskey gave to the BBC specifically about the plane and football tickets. So it says, Mr. McCluskey's lawyers said he paid for his travel in full and recalled travelling with a commercial carrier on one of the flights. They said he occasionally attended football matches with the Falcons, but invariably paid his way, and does not believe he even attended all of the domestic matches as claimed by Unite's report. And they said there is no suggestion Mr. McCluskey breached Unite's gifts or hospitality rules because there was no such policy. Sharon Graham has since introduced a gifts and hospitality policy. Of course, we mentioned Carrie Murphy, but there's no suggestion of wrongdoing on her part whatsoever. Kieran, this doesn't look great, does it?
No, it doesn't look great. And, in a sense, it's a shame, right? I think Len McCluskey, for his members, while he was in charge of Unite, was obviously, in many ways, a very impressive, if flawed, union boss and leader of that union. And, I wouldn't necessarily maybe compare him to Bob Crow, but I think Mick Lynch, he had a real facility with the media. He had a very impressive way of taking no shit, cutting through the crap, and basically being as robust as a union boss needed to be during the austerity years. Nonetheless, this is a really, really bad look. Private jets, whatever, if the allegations are true. It's a really bad look. And I know some of the characters actually a little bit involved. And so I want to speak respectfully, but honestly. And I want to pivot away from the union stuff because Polly covered that really, really well, and just talk a bit about the political party stuff. I mean, I don't think it's a secret, but some of the characters around this, either directly or possibly, have involvement with the new kind of Corbyn Sultana party, which hasn't got off the ground yet. And I think, this, among other things, doesn't bode enormously well. Obviously, I'm behind that party. I want that party to do well. But I think what we've seen so far is not terribly impressive. And I think it's coasted, actually, so far, the reputations of Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana. And I do think, extending from that there is a sense among some of the people around Jeremy Corbyn in 2019, caveated by all the usual things, the sort of uneven media landscape or rigged media landscape or whatever. There is a sense among some of them that they think they have a bit of a divine right to rule the party political left. And I think that's a problem because there were, of course, the media was inimical to Jeremy Corbyn and so on in 2019, but there were still strategic missteps. So obviously I'm veering quite far away from the actual story here, but I think it's relevant for those of us who are thinking about the next steps with that incipient party. And so I think, given that we're up against reform, given that we're up against a massive uphill challenge, it would be good if some of the people around Corbyn in 2019 understood that they absolutely have a central role to play, but that new blood is also necessary, I think, around that outfit.
Protests broke out on Tuesday night in front of a hotel in Canary Wharf in central London. Why? Well, because of false rumours sparked by right-wing agitators who claimed asylum seekers were being relocated there from the Bell Hotel in the Essex town of Epping. Those rumours quickly turned into action. Protesters bearing Union Jack flags and bunting turned up at the hotel, along with left-wing counter-protesters. It wasn't a huge protest with only about 15 police officers stationed outside the hotel, but it wasn't a friendly one either. This was one interaction between the anti-asylum seeker protesters and a counter-protester.
In the conflicts and the climate crisis that causes people to be refugees and have to come to another country, they're not choosing to leave their country at their home, their children, their parents.
Our fucking children, you shouldn't count. Of our children, of this fucking race, you shouldn't count. Fuck off.
These people need somewhere to go.
One of those circulating the fake news was Tommy Robinson, who posted this. It's been widely reported that the government have had all staff fired at the 4-star, £469 a night Britannia International Hotel in Canary Wharf. Got no idea if that's true. Bought up all $450 at the taxpayer's expense to house unvetted migrant men. Reports it's those from the Bell Hotel in Epping. Another was Reform's Tower Hamlets chairman, who said this. I can now confirm that the Britannia International Hotel in Canary Wharf has been handed over for use by asylum seekers and refugees. Our team in Epping have been leading peaceful protests at the Bell Hotel after serious allegations of sexual assault, and they heard some of those being moved on were heading here. Someone went to investigate and saw a coach of 30 being dropped off. Security is now stationed inside the hotel. The Home Office has now confirmed to the Times that no asylum seekers were moved from Epping to Canary Wharf, and the government has reserved the Britannia Hotel for other asylum seekers, and that's at a cost of £81 per night per person, a little lower than the average cost in March of £118 a night, and much lower than Tommy Robinson was suggesting. The background to the scenes at Canary Wharf, of course, is the much larger protests that have taken place in Epping since last Sunday. Residents in the Essex town began protesting mostly peacefully outside the Bell Hotel, which is being used to house asylum seekers. Dozens gathered there after it emerged that an asylum seeker staying at the hotel had been accused of sexual assault. A small number of police protected the hotel, and anti-far-right counter-protesters also turned up. But things soon took a violent turn. This was the moment those counter-protesters came under attack.
Get you, next to none. That one.
You're bleeding.
Oh, what's the matter, mate? What's that on your head? What's that on your head? You've been cut. You've been cut, have you? You're a fucking faggot. You've been cut. You dirty nonsense.
So you can see how, it starts off with one individual being accused of sexual assault. Then that becomes all the asylum seekers in the hotel are paedophiles, and then it goes to anyone who's defending the asylum seekers from attack is a paedophile. So you can see how the kind of scary logic moves along. Last Thursday, the asylum seeker in question was charged with 3 counts of sexual assault, 1 count of inciting a girl to engage in sexual activity, and 1 count of harassment, just 8 days after arriving in the UK by small boat. Those protests started out peacefully with scores of locals turning up outside the Bell Hotel to hear speeches from concerned residents, but the presence of far-right activists, including from groups like Homeland and Blood and Honour, as well as former members of Combat 18 and For Britain, soon sparked violent scenes. So protesters attacked police vans, kicking windscreens and smashing headlamps. Riot police reinforcements were also called, with protesters hurling bottles, fireworks and other objects at police. At another point, police vans carrying extra officers rammed through a barricade, with a second van running into a protester to force him out of the road. Crowds also threw objects at the police. And police also had to protect a small number of counter-protesters from the more aggressive elements in the crowds, shielding them from projectiles and threats of violence. And this is the moment a riot police officer struck back at a protester.
Why are you in bed? Why are you in picking down? You are all witnesses to that. You're fucked.
2 people were arrested in those protests. Last Sunday, there were further protests from residents, again, largely peaceful and mostly led by women, but in the evening, violent scenes erupted once more, leading to 6 more arrests. So did those more violent protests represent the feelings of Epping residents? Well, some of them told Newsnight about their thoughts about the Bell Hotel.
I'm really disappointed that it's been reopened. It's not right. There's a school right by, and it's just not correct. And it's right that the families of this little village actually fight for it. They're not right, they're not reform or anything like that. They're just there to protect their children.
Why do you think it's inappropriate if there's a school nearby, for example?
We don't know where they've come from. We don't know. Well, that sounds so right-wing, but I'm not. I just find it just wrong. And why did they close it in the first place? So I don't think it should be open at all.
It's been such a very stressful situation, I should say, for such a small town.
Has it, that's what it's felt like, it's felt stressful for you?
It's made the town feel very small, and you do feel very isolated, and you do feel a little scared of saying how you feel, like whatever thought process that you have and where people should be moved to and how they should live.
Right.
You do feel a little bit stressed out expressing that with people.
I've just been talking to the council leader, and he said that Tommy Robinson is expected here. What do you think of that?
I'm mixed race. Okay, I'm going to state that. I'm mixed race. I'm old enough to remember the BNP. Tommy Robinson is not racist.
As far as you're concerned, he is welcome here.
I think for me personally, I don't think it's a good idea.
Oh.
Because of the amount of people he'll bring from outside the area. At the moment, it's a local thing for local people who want to voice their opinion and want the government to do something about it. You bring Tommy Robinson here with all the good intentions in the world, I don't think it's going to end well.
That sentence, bring Tommy Robinson here with all the good intentions in the world, as if Tommy Robinson has ever been associated with good intentions. Besides agitating violence in Epping, the right has also used the protests to stir up suspicion of the police. This was Reform leader Nigel Farage.
Have a look at this video.
If these are locals, why are they getting a police car? Where time's the next bus? You wait 15 minutes for a bus and then 3 come all along at once. Look, they're all cramming in.
This shows stand up to racism, as they're called, with Antifa, a violent, thuggish group, arriving at the train station and literally, by Essex police, being bussed to the Bell Hotel. These were the people that caused the disturbances. These were the people that caused the riots. Essex police caused the disturbances.
So I've watched a number of videos of these protests, these riots, whatever you want to call them. And the people who were the anti-racists here, so the sort of stand up to racism people, they just seemed like really, they didn't even seem radical, right? They weren't masked up. They seemed chill, right? If anything, they seemed outnumbered, right? I felt a bit worried for them, right? But the people who were smashing up vans were the right? We've seen the images. The Antifa weren't there. Now, Antifa, to some degree, is sort of a phantom of the right, sort of imagining that there is this nefarious group. There are also protesters that will identify as Antifa. I think especially in some parts of America, like Portland or whatever. I know sort of there's Antifa in Berlin. I'm sure there is some in London as well. But they dress in all black. They sort of cover up their face. And yeah, they might want to smash stuff up. None of them have been anywhere near Epping. People at Epping I've seen the videos. You can look up the videos on the internet. They're very sort of peaceful, nice-looking protesters that don't like racism and want asylum seekers to be welcome. All of the violence that I've seen happening in Epping was from the right. So to me, that just seems like a lie from Nigel Farage. What about his claim, though, that Essex police bussed in counter-protesters? This is sort of a meme which has been spreading. The Daily Telegraph made a slightly different claim on their front page this morning, saying that the police escorted counter-protesters to it, which is a different claim. But let's focus on this one about bussing them in from Nigel Farage, because the Force's chief constable responded to that accusation today.
There's been some accusation in the media that we drove people to the protest. That is not true. We have not driven anybody to that protest. People made their own way there. And of course, one of the accusations and one of the things circulated is we did take people away for their safety, for the safety of everyone there, because it was the best operational thing to do to prevent violence, to diffuse the situation. We drove them away from a violent confrontation. It's not for me to silence or to try and to say to people what they should or shouldn't say. My appeal to people, whether they're the leader of a national party or just somebody who's got a comment to make, is please consider the consequences in the real world of your actions. Is what you are saying going to cause violence or make it work for the people of Epping, for the officers, the staff members at the hotel, the residents, or indeed the local community? That's what you've got to think about.
If you watch the footage of the protest posted on news agencies like Reuters, it's pretty clear that he's right. The police at one point were busing protesters away from the protests, and that's because violence had broken out. The violence in Epping does seem to have concerned the Labour government. They seem to be worried this is going to become another summer of riots, a bit like last summer. Today, Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, has said that immigration and deprivation are causing the UK public to lose faith in politicians. And with the potential for more riots over the summer, she's urged the government to show it's actually helping people. Kieran, very toxic situation. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see a lot more of this kind of thing over the summer. I mean, how are you thinking about it?
Well, it's a completely parlous state of affairs. Or half of the political class, or half of politicians, or whatever quantity, is begging for this kind of thing to happen. It's willing it and praying for it and begging for it because it lubricates their route to power. Right? The other half is completely unwilling to deal with the root causes. So to invest in public services, to roll back years and years of punishing austerity, tackle inequality, and also they're unwilling to, in most cases, there are some noble exceptions, but they're unwilling to tackle head on the kind of media narratives that have done so much to shift the dial to make this kind of, Farageist rhetoric, Robinsonian rhetoric mainstream. And so as a result of that, the reason it feels so bloody parlous and bleak is that what needs to happen is so remote at this moment in time in 2025 in Britain. I think, what needs to happen being proper housing for asylum seekers and refugees, not just putting people in hotels and lining private landlords' pockets and hoteliers or hotel proprietors' pockets, safe passages and so on. Now, even as I say that, I think to myself, you're living in cloud cuckoo land because we are so far away from that. And we're so far away, well, less far away, but I think we're also, unfortunately, at this moment in time, very far away from the kind of root branch or the kind of root cause solutions, like the things I mentioned a moment ago, the investment in public services, economic wealth, redistribution, etc. We're also very far away from that. And so I'm worried that this is going to, as you said, Michael, kind of recur throughout the summer and years beyond that. Obviously, we hope not. And if that does happen, I think everybody who opposes this ought to be ready to mobilize against it because the people in those hotels are traumatized, desperate people who have been treated appallingly at every single interval of their journey, it would seem. Final point is this. This is deep in our country's history, unfortunately. Farage and Robinson are just the latest charlatanic political entrepreneurs trying to make hay with anti-immigration and, anti-ethnic diversity sentiment. Enoch Powell is a very obvious case. But when Enoch Powell said rivers of blood will flow in the streets of Britain, it wasn't a prediction. It was a proscription. He was asking for it. And the reason he was asking for it and militating for it was so that his successors, the likes of Farage and Robinson and so on, could use it to get into formal power, something that Powell never really managed to do beyond a cabinet and several seats around the country as an MP. And so in a way, they're the inheritors of his big dream. And before Enoch Powell, long before Enoch Powell, the Aliens Act of 1905 was passed to prevent the influx, as people saw it, of aliens from the Russian Empire who are fleeing the pogroms against Jews in Russian Empire. So, yeah, this is deep in our country's consciousness, unfortunately. It just takes a few pieces of bad luck and a bit of austerity and a few charismatic entrepreneurs, fortunately Farage is charismatic, to call it up very effectively and turn it into translate it into electoral success.
I mean, I agree with you on the idea that half the political system is trying to whip this up because they think it's the route to power. So, I mean, namely reform, and I think the Conservatives as well. Labour is where I think, which is obviously objectionable and awful. Labour, I think, is just where it's been completely self-defeating, because it really doesn't help Labour for this to be a massive issue, right? There's sort of no way they can come out of this well. And they have created the worst of both worlds, because they sort of bought into the Tory idea that the biggest problem was the boats. They said, stop the boats, stop the boats, stop the boats. They sort of bought into the idea that these hotels were a big problem, and they haven't stopped the boats and people are still in the hotels. And so they're in a very difficult position, because they can't say, you guys are wrong. We can deal with this as a country. There isn't a small boats crisis. Yes, there's a small boats challenge, right? It's not ideal, obviously, but it's not the crisis it's being made out to be. And we're going to slowly get a handle on it. But instead, what they've said is, this is a massive crisis facing Britain. We need to stop the boats. We need to clear out the hotels. By the way, we're not going to do it, which is just a very toxic combination, because it does sort of, I suppose, mean that these right-wingers can say, well, we're just doing what you told us we should do. You said the boats were bad. You said the hotels were bad. We're trying to scare people away from crossing the channel or staying in these hotels, right? So it's the same way that sort of the left talks about direct action, which is we're going to create facts on the ground because you're not doing it quickly enough. And I suppose Labour are just completely trapped here, because they've said this is a massive problem, and then they can't do anything whatsoever about it. I think obviously this is being whipped up by the far right. I do think the policy of housing lots and lots of recently arrived young men, asylum seekers, in hotels and then banning them from work is just a very toxic combination. I mean, all the studies on, I've read it in sort of the context of recidivism. So people who are coming out of prison say the biggest predictor of someone committing a crime is them not having a job. So if you get out of prison and you go into a job, your chances of staying on the straight and narrow are reasonably good. If you come out of prison and you don't find a job, then the likelihood of you ending up back in prison are very, very high. And so to have a bunch of vulnerable young men who you put in a hotel all in one place, very visibly in potentially a small town, and then you ban them from getting jobs, it is just a recipe for social tension, which is why I don't think this will be the last of this. I imagine we will see more of this summer. And frankly, I think the only thing that stopped the riots last summer was the police coming down really, really hard, and then people going to prison for a really long time. So I'm sure Keir Starmer will be willing to use that tactic again, but it doesn't really seem to be getting to the root of the problem. Kieran, do you want a final word on this before we wrap up?
Well, one thing I was going to say was maybe a bit too abstract, but basically someone said something recently which really made me think, which is that actually the collapse of the British Empire has never actually been an election issue. You can't find an election since the collapse of the British Empire where it was actually an election issue, or a politician was punished. A lot of the collapse of the empire happened on Churchill's watch in the early 50s. Obviously, the national icon of the 20th century for the right, as much as anyone in the centre. So it was never really an election issue. What I think maybe that's done is it's created a kind of slow release resentment, slow release poison into the bloodstream, into the lifeblood of the country's politics. I said it was an abstract point. Don't expect any kind of material or empirical substantiation. But I do think that there's something in that. In most countries, in France, the entire republic fell because of the collapse of empire. In other European countries that have lost their empires, huge consequences for the political class. Ours is an outlier in that sense. And I do think some of these these revenants, these ghosts that come back and speak through different elections differently about integration, immigration, the loss of empire, decline, and so on. It's quite possibly related to that.
Yeah, I'm not convinced, because I think you're seeing a similar thing in France. You're seeing a similar thing in Germany. You're seeing, the various countries' history of empire doesn't seem to have a huge impact on how the asylum, refugee, migration question is approached. But we don't have time for that. We can go into that another day. Kieran, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you for having me, Michael. Cheers.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.